times, it seems like chaos, but there are surprisingly few accidents. Amongst all these boats is the city's most famous one, the gondola, and of course, the gondolier. Back in the 17th century, there were around 10,000. Today, there are just over 400. And each gondolier has to know Venetian history and be able to handle the gondola in the tight spaces of the canals. The busiest thoroughfare in the city is the S-shaped Grand Canal. The shape probably follows the ancient river that once flowed through the marshes. Lining the banks of the 4-kilometre canal are over 170 buildings, mostly dating from the 13th to the 18th centuries. Most of these palazzos were built to show off the owner's wealth and status and cost a small fortune to build. Until the 19th century, only the Rialto Bridge crossed the Grand Canal. The present bridge was built in 1591 and has 2 rows of shops on it. It was predicted to fall down, but has stood for over 400 years. In the main districts of Venice, there are over 100 churches, many of them architectural masterpieces. One of the most important is the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore, on a small island opposite St. Mark's. There has been a church here since the 10th century. But in 1565, Andrea Palladio, an architect we will hear much more of later in this journey, replaced the old Gothic church with this striking classical design. The foundation stone was laid in the presence of the Pope. The bell tower fell down in 1774 and was rebuilt in a similar style to the one in the Piazza San Marco. From the top are wonderful views over the city. As Venice became richer and more powerful, it needed ships to trade and warships to protect them, as the city inevitably attracted enemies. The Venetian arsenal certainly existed in the early 13th century and may well have been around much earlier. Up until the late 18th century, this was the largest industrial complex in Europe, building ships in an almost assembly line process, unique for its time. By 1450, over 3,000 Venetian ships were in operation, both as supply vessels as well as warships. This massive fleet led to Venice becoming the greatest commercial power the European world had yet seen. This power ended when the city and its surrounding islands were conquered by Napoleon in 1797. It was only in 1866 that the city finally became part of the newly created Kingdom of Italy. 40 miles north of Venice are the southern foothills of the Alps, and in this hilly landscape are a number of beautiful villas from the 16th to 18th centuries. A few were designed by Andrea Palladio and have since become some of the most important historic houses, not only in Italy, but worldwide. One of Palladio's best works is the Villa Emo at Fanzolo. His brilliance was his use of mathematical proportions and his simplicity of style. The villa was designed for the Emo family as a working farm, and Palladio created the 2 wings for agricultural use, with access under a colonnade, for cover from the sun as well as the rain. It's hard to believe, looking at the clean lines of this classical building, that it was completed, as we see it today, in 1565. This was an age when most of Western Europe was still building wood-beamed houses and fortified manors. The impact that Palladio's houses had on visiting architects was enormous. From the 18th century to today, they have come from across Europe and as far afield as the United States. The Villa Emo is now a World Heritage Site. Another of Palladio's houses is 7 miles to the north at Mazere. It's also a World Heritage Site. This is the Villa Barbaro, which is also known as the Villa di Mazara. It was completed in 1558, a few years before Palladio began work on the Villa Emo. Here, the central section was inspired by an ancient temple in Rome and adapted for domestic use, which was Palladio's genius. The main block is then flanked by two wings, which have two floors, but fronted by an open colonnade. As at the Villa Emo, the lower rooms were for estate business, and the upper rooms were private living quarters. At the rear of the house is a spring-fed grotto, or nymphaeum. Palladio did not really involve himself in garden design, and this pretty addition was probably the conception of the Barbaro family.